Hey everybody, welcome to week 5 of PS 398. I know it's hard to believe, but by the end of this week, you will be 1/3 of the way through this Herculean trial that you have chosen for yourself. And you're like, I'm pretty sure that you have some say in how Herculean this trial is, Rob. And that's true. Challenging classes exist, right? And I don't know if this is one of them or not. Wherever you are in your journey, it's really useful to commend yourself when you choose something difficult. And so if this is difficult for you, I commend you for sticking with it and for making it 1/3 of the way through. And if this hasn't been hard for you so far, then 1, I'm sorry. 2, you're a jerk because it was hard for me when I learned it. And 3, it's going to get harder, so don't worry. And those of you that think it's hard right now, you're getting so much stronger. You don't even realize what you're going to be capable of. We're only 1/3 of the way in. So up to this point, we've talked about problems of rationality, rational choice theory. We've discussed that from 2 angles. One, we talked about rational choice, both in the certain case where there's a set of alternatives, Coke, Pepsi, Sprite, and you're choosing one of them, and you know for sure that when you make a choice, then you get what you get. And we've also talked about choice under uncertainty. We've talked about what it is to make a choice when you don't quite know. We've known how to choose a lottery, which is good because so many of the processes at work in international relations are probabilistic, are uncertain. So I'm glad that we've covered both of those. And we've also discussed this unique methodological issue in international relations, where we want to be able to talk about country A or country B, and we want them to have preferences. We want to be able to say country A has a preference relation, country A has a utility function. And in the week on preference aggregation, we discussed the unique issues that arise in trying to come up with a somewhat acceptable way to aggregate preferences to something consistent enough that you could equip a country with a utility function. What are the conditions under which transitivity of the weak preference relation is maintained? So that's where we are. We have not talked about a whole lot of strategy. There has been no strategy at work yet. We have to work our way toward game theory. One thing worth noting is that all rational choice theory, all mathematical rational choice theory, begins from the same set of fables that you've seen. What is rationality and what is rationality under uncertainty are 2 of the most important questions that somebody has to answer before they try to develop a theory of any strategic process, including international relations. And then how various actors interact with one another depends on what flavor of theory you're under. You've already seen one flavor of theory with social choice theory, where there isn't really a mechanism given. Instead, we just say, imagine that there's some preference aggregation rule, and all of the strategy, all of the debate, all of the conversation, all of the interaction, that's way out at the margins. What we care about in social choice theory, what we care about in the Erovian framework that we've discussed, what we care about there is just how the preferences get aggregated. We don't talk about how. We might encode a particular preference aggregation rule, but even then, there isn't any particular interaction at work. Conversely, if this was a class in microeconomic theory, for example, we would say, okay, well, imagine that consumers maximize utility functions the same way that we've described, and assume that firms maximize profit functions, which aren't very different from what we've discussed up to this point. And under those assumptions of rationality, under those agent-level assumptions, assume perfect competition and have some set of prices arise to equilibrate supply and demand. And that's, an important avenue of rational choice theory. In game theory, we don't think that's true. We want to avoid perfect competition. We want to say, what happens in the alternative world where instead of not mattering in the ultimate, as one does in the standard neoclassical Laurasian model of markets, how do we interact with one another when we have perfect agency, in the sense that our choices influence outcomes? So that's what game theory is about. And game theory has an important place in international relations. One reason for that is that countries do seem to have agency under many of their processes. They don't respond the same way that consumers respond to prices. If I go to the mini mart and I want a Diet Coke, I have no agency over the price of Diet Coke. The price is what it is, and I either pay it or I don't, but it doesn't really matter how my choices influence that price. Conversely, when I go to buy a car, or when I go to buy a house, I do have some agency over that price. I engage in bargaining. I engage in haggling. There's negotiation involved. I matter in that process in a way that I don't when I buy a Diet Coke. And basically, we're operating under the assumption that many, if not all countries, have that sort of sovereignty, have that sort of agency over a wide set of outcomes that matter to them. So they're more car buyers than they are Diet Coke buyers. But if that's the case, then we need to talk about bargaining. Because once you have agency, once you're involved in negotiation, once you're involved in haggling, once we're talking about the details in a way that a Diet Coke buyer doesn't get to, once we're doing that, then we need to understand the problem itself. What is the problem of bargaining? Think about all the different negotiations that happen between countries. So in the run-up to war, two countries might be deciding how they're going to come to some agreement. They might be trying to divide territory just to animate things. And they're involved in negotiations about where to draw a border. And so they're trying to figure out how to draw a border, and if they fail to draw a border, then they might have to fight a war with one another in order to figure out where the border is going to be set. That's a bargaining process. Imagine two countries involved in trade relations, trying to figure out what acceptable tariff rates would look like on a variety of different industries and sectors, right? So at that point in time, you send over dozens and scores and hundreds of technocratic negotiators to try to figure out exactly how to hammer out all the details of important trade deals, these bilateral free trade agreements, or these oftentimes multilateral free trade agreements. How does that bargaining process look? What is the protocol by which that bargaining process plays out? Of course, we see bargaining in international institutions, right? So if we're trying to figure out what a resolution ought to look like, if we're hammering out the details about how to write a particular international resolution at the United Nations, right? I'm not a Diet Coke buyer. If I'm at the table, I'm bargaining, I'm negotiating, I'm trying to figure out how to advance my interests amid people for whom their preferences might be opposed to my own. Suddenly, we're in a new social world. These are not decision makers in isolation, but they're also not Arovian voters. They're not just sitting there waiting to have their preferences aggregated. They're involved in particular processes, particular procedures. They have a particular problem. None of this is new. What I'm saying to you isn't an especially novel idea. This is the way that most international relations scholars, at least within the strategic tradition, look at pre-war crises, look at free trade agreements, look at international institutions. From the strategic point of view, bargaining is one of the most important processes / problems that we can think about. So rather famously, in 1960, economist Thomas Schelling, he was sort of one of the early pioneers of how to use game theory and game theoretic thinking to discuss international relations, particularly conflict he was interested in. And so he wrote in 1960 a very well-known book entitled The Strategy of Conflict. That's another book. Again, I wish that we had a book club, and I wish I didn't have to show you all. No, I don't. I'm happy about the things I'm showing you. I'm choosing to show you the things that I'm showing you. I wish that I had 8 credit hours to work with so that I could show you some books too. But The Strategy of Conflict, that's a book you should be able to get very inexpensively. It has almost no mathematics. The numbers are the page numbers. Nevertheless, it's written from a strategic, rationalist point of view. And in that book, rather famously, Schelling argues that war is essentially a bargaining problem. And that really set the stage for the current understanding about where interstate violence comes from. And not just interstate violence, that's been extended to intrastate. We think about civil violence from a bargaining standpoint very often as well. All of this harkens back to Clausewitz, whom we discussed last week. So in On War, Clausewitz argues rather famously that war is just the continuation of politics by other means. So when we think about politics, we think about voting or something like that. But oftentimes I think about, at least pre-Sunshine Law days, I think about a bunch of legislators sitting in a smoke-filled room hammering out the details of how a law is going to be written, right? If war is the continuation of that by other means, then that means that war is bargaining. So we need to understand bargaining. Bargaining is super important in the international relations tradition, and so I want to spend a week on it. I want us to understand what a bargaining problem is. What is bargaining? And remarkably, this concept of bargaining, the structure of a bargaining problem, we're going to be able to say what bargaining is relatively concisely. But we're going to be able to do more than that. We're going to be able to link this problem of bargaining to an important normative criterion, optimality, Pareto-optimality, and demonstrate, actually under a wide variety of contexts, that all of these bargaining processes, all of these bargaining problems, have important normative targets, which is to say good deals that could be struck. We're going to be able to view through the lens of bargaining what success would look like, what good would look like. Now that's going to be in a relatively minimal and weak sense. I'm not going to be able to say, oh, well, here's everything you need to know about what a just outcome is in international relations. And this was part of the provocative thought from Preference Aggregation Week. So I'm not going to be able to paint a complete picture. I'm only going to be able to show you one small, minimal criterion. It's not the only criterion. There are going to be many outcomes that will satisfy this criterion that are not good by most people's evaluations. Right? So this is not the end-all be-all, but it's a very important starting point, and it highlights just how high the stakes are. So today is a day that's going to be straightforward and simple. It will be only in 2 blocks. So in the A block, I want us to dig in very deeply to this concept of Pareto-optimality. I want us to be able to visualize good and bad outcomes through this lens. And I'm going to use a particular fable to try to motivate that I'll take some pains to try to turn it slightly into an international relations looking problem, but this is more general than that. So Pareto-optimality, what is it? How do we know it when we see it? How do we know failure of this criterion when we see it? And just what is it to see it? And then the B block, having sort of gotten our intuitions honed on this one particular vision, this one particular depiction of international relations through this Pareto lens, I want to say what a bargaining problem is. And we'll be able to use what we've done up to this point from the bargaining model of war to paint a beautiful picture, an absolutely beautiful picture about what's going on in bargaining problems. Now, I'm not going to go all the way. We're not going to be able to say, oh, well, and here's the solution to a bargaining problem, because the answers to that question come in many flavors, all of which will be strictly game theoretic. But before we talk about the processes of bargaining, we need to understand the problem of bargaining. And in order for us to be able to understand the problem of bargaining, we need to be able to visualize Pareto efficiency. So we're getting super duper close. It's all starting to come into focus. This is turning into a beautiful international relations laden picture. I hope that you're starting to see it. I hope you're just as excited as I am. Let's get started. So what's Pareto efficiency, or optimality? You hear both of the terms, efficiency and optimality. I wish I could tell you that I was only going to use one today, but that just isn't true. So I'll mix over efficiency and optimality, but no matter what, I'm talking about Pareto efficiency or Pareto optimality, where these are both named after Italian economist Vilfredo Pareto. You may have seen these terms used before, in which case this should be a pretty good brush up, and maybe you'll get something that you didn't see before. If you haven't seen this, then you may have seen it without even knowing it, because oftentimes people will just talk about efficiency or optimality, and they'll mean Pareto efficiency or optimality, but they won't even say that. So this might be something that you've seen before, and if not, the intuitions are relatively straightforward. So in order for me to introduce this concept of Pareto optimality, I actually want to talk about a social planning problem. I think this is the easiest way to see what's going on, and in particular, I want to try to turn this into a bit of an international relations thing, but if it doesn't smell all the way IR, don't give me too much trouble for that. We'll be there very soon, but I hope that you'll begin to see how this is all coming together. But in order for me to show this to you, I need to make a trip to the bookshelf of awesomeness, so you just wait here, and I'm going to go to the bookshelf of awesomeness. I'm really angry at myself for not getting a copy of the Schelling book, Strategy of Conflict, when last time I was at the office, but it wasn't quite worth going on a trip all by itself. So, from the bookshelf of awesomeness, I have procured 3 items. Oh, it's going to be a long lecture. If that's how I'm talking at you right now, whoever you is, I have procured 3 items. 1 is a bowl labeled State A. And it's an empty bowl. For now. Another is a bowl labeled State B. It too is an empty bowl. For now. And finally, I have a bowl. Oh, it's going to get more exciting suddenly. I have a bowl labeled Total. And it has 10 pennies in it. It now has 9 pennies now that one has been dropped upon my microphone. That may have just caused you some ear trauma. I wish that my sound editor was better, but he sucks. So imagine that I am a social planner, or in this story, let's say that I'm a third-party mediator. Suppose that I am another country that has been called in to help settle a dispute between 2 countries, call them A and B. I should put these this way. How about some UX UI? To you, this is the left side, and this is the right side. Let me calibrate myself. This is my left, and this is my right. This is my left, and this is my right. Now you're probably going to read some story. Professor dies in fiery car crash driving on wrong side of road after telling himself that this was the left side. We'll talk about that next week? Next week. Not my death in a fiery car crash. Stop getting excited. We'll talk about the problem of state and how is the same as what side of the road you drive on. Just trust me. And you're like, I've been trusting you for 5 weeks and I haven't gotten anywhere. You've gotten a lot further than you realize. So suppose that I'm a third party and I'm trying to solve a dispute between A and B. All right? So my job is to figure out how to make them happy. I want to make them both happy because in this story, I'm a completely benevolent. I'm not rational. I'm not operating under any self-help principles. All right? At this stage of the game, I'm just trying to distribute pennies in a way that makes them happy. Because that's just how I roll. So let's think about all the different ways that I could distribute the pennies between these 2 people. Well, you see one right now. This is a possible distribution of pennies. They have no pennies. Right? It is a possible situation that neither of them has any pennies. And you can assume that the pennies represent, like, I don't know, tracts of land or things that they care about. All right? The idea here is they want more pennies. I had to count them. I'm really bad at counting. I told this to my other class last week. I'm very bad at counting. So let's just visualize another possibility here. So another possible distribution is I give State A 1 penny. This is State A, and now they used to have a penny. They have a penny again. Okay? So this is a possible distribution of pennies. 1 for State A and 0 for State B. Totally possible. Totally possible. Maybe that strikes you as unegalitarian, so let me give State B 1 as well. So now State A has a penny, State B has a penny. Well, let's think about the set of all possible distribution of pennies. That's going to be our possibility set. Okay? So, I have 10 pennies to give, and they're discrete. I don't have a smelter anywhere in the house. I just keep giving you personal information left and right. There are 0 smelters in my home. So I can't break these pennies up. So I can give you, so State A can have 1 penny, 2 penny, 3 penny, 4 penny, 5 penny, 6 penny, 7 penny, 8 penny, 9 penny, or 10 penny. So any given state can have 0, 1, 2, ... up to 10 pennies. And the same for the other state. Okay? But I only have 10 pennies to give. So I need to know both numbers. So let's say, for example, that I leave 5 pennies in for country B, and I've got 5 for country A. So now I've got 5 pennies apiece. So what's interesting about this is now they add to 10, which is how many I had. So basically, the set of all possible distributions, it's the set of all ordered pairs where the first number is country A's number of pennies, and the second number of is country B's number of pennies. And so basically, it's the set of all ordered pairs where each of these is a counting number, or 0, sometimes a counting number, 0, 1, 2, 3, ... up to 10. Each number is one of those, and they can't add to more than 10. So the sum of, let's say, x sub A and x sub B has got to be no more than 10, less than or equal to 10. Remember, they can both have empty bowls. 0, 0 has to be in this set. So does 10, 0. So does 0, 10. And so does, I actually got that, 5, 5. These all need to be in there, okay? So I don't want to talk about sets for very long. I think it's more interesting if we try to visualize this. So let's put this in two-dimensional space. So let's draw, high school algebra time. Let's draw the set of all distributions where the horizontal axis is how many pennies country A has, and the vertical axis is how many pennies country B has. Yeah? So any given distribution of pennies is going to be a dot in this space. I'll call attention to a couple of the dots just to show you that we can depict this. So consider the situation where they both have no pennies. Well, that's 0, 0. So that's just the origin. That's just, I'm guessing with my finger where that's going to be. Ding! That's my guess. Right? But that's 0, 0. It's just, that's the point where neither of them have any pennies. Let's just get all of the sort of boundary points handled. So imagine that state A has 10 pennies. 10 pennies for state A. And of course, that means 0 for state B. You know that because they can't have more than 10 pennies total. Well, that's the point 10, 0. So I need to move 10 units over to the right. So I move 10 units over to the right, and there's a dot too. That's the dot 10, 0. I can't go any further to the right because I only have 10 pennies to give. Okay? Suppose I gave all 10 pennies to country B. Well, now I need to go all the way back to the vertical axis, and I need to climb up 10, and there's the point 0, 10 up there. I went way too high. 0, 10 is not here. 0, 10 is like here probably. All right, so here's 0, 10. So these are also sort of the extreme points, and what I have, let's just keep drawing some. Let's just look and see what we get. So I'm just going to call out numbers, and then the editor version of me is really angry because I'm going to have to make all these drawings, but I'm just going to call some out. 5, 5. That's 1. That's 5 and 5. That's an allowable one. What about, I don't know, how about 3? 3 for country A and 1 for country B. That's a dot. 3, 1. 6, 4. 1, 1. 8, 2. 1, 7. Okay, you're starting to get the sense that actually, if I put all the dots up there, it's a triangle. Okay? So this is just a triangle. All of the possible ways of divvying these pennies, that you can array them in this beautiful triangle. Does that look like a triangle? That looks like a triangle. Okay? And we're acting on the assumption that country A gets happier as we move more and more to the east, and country B gets happier as we move more and more to the north. So suppose I happen to have right now, state A has 3 pennies and state B has 1 penny. So right now I am at the dot 3, 1. Okay? And let's just suppose that I decided, because that means I've got 6 left in my total bowl. I still have 6 pennies to play with. So let's just suppose that I give each state 1 more penny. So now I find myself at 4, 2. Okay? I'm still in the interior of the triangle. I just made them both happier, but I'm still in the interior. Right? The idea here is that I can keep adding pennies, and if that takes me north, then I made country B happier, and if that takes me east, then it makes country A happier. And if it moves northeast, I made them both happier. So right now I'm at 4, 2. I'm in the interior of the triangle. You'll note that there's a dot 1 north, right? That's 4, 3. That would make country B happier without making country A any sadder. I could move 1 east. That would take me to 5, 2. And that would make state A happier without making state B any sadder. Or I could even move northeast by 1 each way, and that would take me to 5, 3. Let's do that. So now I'm at 5, 3. We're at the dot 5, 3, which is still in the interior of the triangle. Why is that? Because I still have undivvied pennies, right? That frontier of the triangle, those are all of the allocations of pennies where I'm out of pennies to give. Okay, you're starting to see, it's starting to come together here. That's my scarcity frontier, all right? So now I'm at 5, 3, which is still south of that frontier, right? And it's also still west of that frontier. It's southwest of the frontier. So I still have 2 pennies to give. Let's just say, for fun, that I give both pennies to state A. Now I'm at 7, 3. I'm at the dot 7, 3, which is on the frontier. How do I know it's on the frontier? I'm out of pennies. I have no more pennies to give. I'm out of pennies. The number of pennies in these 2 bowls, it's 7 and 3. That adds to 10. Okay? So now I'm on the frontier of the triangle. This frontier of this triangle has a very special name. It's the Pareto frontier. Okay? The idea of Pareto optimality is it's an outcome where you couldn't make one party strictly happier without making another party strictly sadder. So this frontier is different qualitatively than the interior of the triangle for these sort of Pareto reasons that I'll be explaining for about 10 more minutes. We'll see. So notice that from this point, 7, 3, I'm at 7, 3. And suppose that state B was still very unhappy at this position, 7, 3. They're still angry. They're angry enough that they would rather fight than accept my negotiated settlement. Suppose that I need to make country B happier because 3 just isn't cutting it for them. Okay. So suppose I had to do that. I don't have any pennies. I'm out of pennies. I don't have any pennies to give state B. Where am I going to get a penny from? Oh, from state A. So now I got to go to state A, and I'm like, hey, state B isn't real happy right now. They're going to fight. They want to fight you. They want to fight you because they don't like this outcome that I came up with. Could you please do me a solid and give me a penny to give to state B? And let's say that state A was happy where they sat, and 6, they wouldn't want to fight at 6. So they're like, okay, yeah, I'll give you a penny. So now I take it. I'm gonna get this on camera. This is on camera. This is a very important thing. This is news. This is national. This is international news. I'm about to win a Nobel Peace Prize for this. You don't understand. This is not a penny. This is Sinai. This is not a penny. All right? So now, in Nobel Peace Prize winning things, I'm going to take a penny away from state A. Maybe we just made peace. This might be one of the most amazing days of all time. However, notice that in order for me to make state B happier, I had to make state A sadder. At the frontier, it is impossible for me to go up, which makes state B happier. It is impossible for me to go east, which makes state A happier. It is impossible for me to go northeast and make them both happier. This is a Pareto optimal outcome. That is sort of, in broad brushstrokes, that's the concept of Pareto optimality, is it isn't possible for there to be any opportunities for win-win. There are no win-win outcomes. If the status quo is Pareto efficient, then there's nothing I can do that would be win-win. Just to make sure we're all on the same page, consider the point, let's say, suppose that country A had 5 pennies. This is not a penny, but it's a penny. Oh. So, imagine that country A has 5 pennies and country B has 4 pennies. That means that there's 1 penny left in my total, okay? So I've got a 5-4. Notice that with this 1 penny, I could have made country A happier by going to 6-4, or I could have made country B happier by going to 5-5. This penny could have made either of them happier. So 5-4 is not Pareto efficient. It is not Pareto optimal. There's my solution I'm just gonna say them both every time, except then I'll break that promise. So a Pareto optimal outcome is one where I don't have any extra pennies. I didn't leave any happiness on the table, right? An outcome is Pareto efficient if no happiness was left on the table. I just missed. I'm at point blank range. All I had to do was this. And then I missed. I did this. Now, in my own defense, it got a little bit stuck because that's what pennies do, but still, kind of pathetic. 5-5, Pareto efficient. 5-4, not Pareto efficient. Why? Because I still have some happiness on the table. This is my total bowl. This is where the happiness comes from, and I left some happiness in there. So just while we're here, observe that if we are inside the triangle, if we're at the interior of the triangle, anywhere in the interior of the triangle, there are opportunities for win-win. So if we're at the interior of the triangle, then that means that there exist other outcomes that are at least as good for everybody and strictly better for one of the people at minimum, right? So from 5-4, I can make country B happier without making country A any sadder. I can make country A happier without making country B any sadder. Okay? Notice that if I had 2 pennies to work with, so if I was at 5-3 instead of 5-4, now I could make them both strictly happier if I wanted to. So, interior of the triangle is the zone of win-win. There are win-win opportunities inside of this triangle. But along that Pareto frontier, when I was at 7-3, here I'm at 7-3 again. If I want to make somebody happier, I have to make somebody else sadder. This is a unit of zero-summiness. I just went from 7-3 to 6-4. It was zero sum. Everything that country B got, country A lost. If I had gone from 7-3 to 8-2, everything that country A got was something that country B lost. So the frontier of our triangle, the set of good outcomes, the set of Pareto optimal outcomes, is the area where if you ride around that area, you're in the world of zero sum. So the idea, the normative force of Pareto efficiency is that it's a sad story if we leave resources, if we leave happiness on the table. We want to make, this is why efficiency is one of the words that you hear for it, is we don't want it to be the case that we didn't make maximal use of our resources. We don't want it to be the case that whatever the outcome was, it wasn't one that did, plainly speaking, the greatest good for the greatest number. We'll talk about that momentarily. However, notice, just to be completely explicit, if I have 10 coins for state A and 0 coins for state B, in that situation, 10 and 0, that's Pareto efficient. Pareto efficient outcome. I couldn't make anybody happier without making somebody else sadder. Would you call this a good outcome? Well, that depends. I'm not going to tell you what to think about that, but most people have an instinct that it isn't good for one party to have everything and the other party to have nothing. They don't view that as a positive. Okay? So, Pareto efficiency has nothing to say about egalitarianism. It has nothing to say about distributional concerns. Okay? So the point, for example, consider the point 4-4. Consider the point 4-4. So now I'm at 4-4. Country A has 4. Country B has 4. So I'm at 4-4. Not Pareto efficient. How do I know it's not Pareto efficient? Well, it's not Pareto efficient because I still have pennies in my total. Not anymore because of gravity, but okay. This is highly egalitarian. We're right on that 45-degree line. There's a line that starts at the origin and goes up 45 degrees, and everywhere along that line is perfectly egalitarian, right? 0, 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, the aforementioned 4, 4, and so on. Okay. Not Pareto efficient, highly egalitarian, all right? Now, suppose, for example, that this highly egalitarian setup arose because there was a system in place that helped to transfer resources from those that had more to those that had less. Maybe that government cost 2 points, cost 2, right? Maybe that cost 2. Now, how you weigh egalitarianism against efficiency, that's a personal thing. I got nothing to tell you about that. I'm just saying that this is the starting point for a lot of analyses. This efficiency criterion is something to have in mind. It's not the only thing to have in mind, but it is a useful thing to have in mind. So how would we encode Pareto efficiency? What does that look like in symbols? Or how would we come up with a formal definition that wasn't quite so percussive? Okay, well, let's just begin from the outcome set again. So let's say that we have a set of possible outcomes, X. Capital X, where that might be how many, and so in this previous example, X was the set of all pairs of integers greater than or equal to 0 and where they sum to less than 10. That was our set of possible outcomes. It can be something highly multidimensional. It can be a very complicated policy space. It can be territory. It can be all of the different industry sector sort of things. You can imagine trying to set a tax rate on each of those. So it can be very multidimensional if you wanted, but simpler is better. So suppose we had that, and suppose that we had 2 countries. Let's just start with 2 agents. I don't want to say so 2 agents, A and B, right? This might be 2 countries. It might be 2 individuals. It might be 2 political parties. It might be 2 negotiators at the United Nations. Whatever the case may be, we've got 2 agents right now, A and B. And let's equip them both with a utility function. So that utility function is going to read in alternatives, X, and it's going to spit out happiness numbers, R. And I can index that utility function so that I've got U of party A and U of party B. So that's sort of all of our fundamentals. And then we'll say that a given outcome, so efficiency is something that pertains to an outcome, right? It's an outcome driven. It's a consequentialist sort of thing here. So we say that a given alternative, X, is Pareto efficient if it isn't Pareto dominated by another alternative Y, is what I'm going to tell you here, right? So the idea here is that, so from 4-4, I could find another alternative, 5-5, that made both parties strictly happier. So the idea here is that you don't want to be able to find a better alternative. So a given alternative X is Pareto efficient, Pareto optimal, if there does not exist another feasible alternative Y. Right, so the idea here is we don't want it to be the case that there's some better alternative out there, call it Y for right now, such that for both parties, U of Y is greater than or equal to U of X. So everybody's at least as happy as they were at outcome Y as they are at outcome X. And at least one of these inequalities holds strictly. So the idea here is if Y Pareto dominates X, what that means is that everybody at least prefers Y to X, and somebody, at least one person, strictly prefers Y to X. Okay? So that's Pareto optimality. The idea of Pareto optimality is that we don't want it to be the case that some better outcome is out there where it's at least as good for everybody else, and it's strictly better for at least one person. We don't want to be able to go from 5-4, right? At 5-4, I could make at least one party happier without making anybody else strictly sadder, right? So 6-4 is just as good for country B as 5-4 was, and it's strictly better for country A. Likewise, 5-5 is just as good for country A as 5-4 was, but it's strictly better for country B. So both 5-5 and 6-4 Pareto dominate 5-4. Okay? So in the context of our triangle, what that means is at a Pareto efficient outcome, you can never go due north, because that makes party B strictly happier. And you can never go due east, because that makes party A strictly happier. And you certainly could never go northeast, because that makes both parties strictly happier. So the picture has to look like this. It has to be Pareto efficiency relies on this idea that that you can't go that way and you can't go that way. Now notice that from the interior of the triangle, you could always go at least due west or at least due north. Sorry, due east and north. And sometimes you could even go northeast. Okay? So that's what it looks like for two parties. Let's get rid of the visual intuitions, and let me just, for completeness sake, let me just tell you what this looks like for n agents. So this time we'll have a set of alternatives, x again, same as before. But now, just like in the Arovian framework, let's suppose that we have n players, and that can be 1 ... little n, and that's our players in this game. Although we don't have a game just yet, we just have a situation. And let's equip every actor, every agent, every individual with a utility function. So I'll just say UI, which reads in X, it reads in alternatives, and it spits out happiness numbers. Okay? So everybody has a utility function. Each of the n agents in society, that could be 2 like it just was, that could be 3 or 4 or 5, that could be 200, one for every country, that could be, billions, billions and billions, that's one for every individual, who knows? So we say that a given alternative, X, is Pareto efficient or Pareto optimal if there isn't some other alternative, Y, this is just like before, such that everybody is at least as happy at Y as they are at X, and at least one party is strictly happier at Y than they are at X. So we get to use a for all and a there exists, but it's the same logic. Okay? So that's Pareto optimality, as framed through the lens of a social planner, or in this case, a third-party mediator that's trying to divvy pennies to keep two countries happy. It's a useful normative tool. Pareto optimal outcomes are rare in the sense that there aren't many of them with respect to all possible outcomes. And so it's interesting when we hit that target. It's interesting when a given process yields a Pareto efficient or Pareto optimal outcome. It also sets a nice normative target, right? So next week, we'll be writing out our first games, and you'll be shown the prisoner's dilemma. It might not be the first time that you've seen it, but the prisoner's dilemma is something that we're going to use very often. And the reason that the prisoner's dilemma is so famous is simply the fact that one of the outcomes, Pareto dominates the predicted outcome. That's it. So no matter how you slice the prisoner's dilemma, the prediction is the same. It's always the sad version of the story where everybody cheats on each other. Okay? And the reason that it's sad is that one of the outcomes is strictly better for both parties than what ends up happening. It Pareto dominates. Okay? So Pareto efficiency is the reason that the prisoner's dilemma is what it is. There are other processes that are interesting with respect to whether or not they generate Pareto efficiency. So the aforementioned neoclassical market model, right? The Walrasian model of supply and demand. Sort of baby's first market model. The outcome of that is always Pareto efficiency without any of the sort of usual problems. So under the standard assumptions, the outcome of trade is Pareto efficient. Nothing gets left on the table. That's the first fundamental theorem of welfare economics. Proved by who? Ken Arrow. This also taps into utilitarianism, right? So in the 19th century, there was a school of thought. There still is a school of thought, but it was a particularly influential and bleeding edge school of thought at the time in industrializing England called utilitarianism. John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, many others. And so their idea, this is when utility theory was relatively new. The idea of a utility function was relatively new, and people were very sanguine about the scientific merits of utility as opposed to today. And so the idea was that you could use this idea of comparable utilities to say, okay, well, let's define a welfare function that reads in an alternative and it spits out a sum of everybody's happiness number. Right? So I set a policy, let's say I'm the social planner, and I choose a policy, X. And you've got a utility function for X, and Chewy has a utility function for X, and Lucy has a utility function for X, and all of you have a utility function for X. Everybody in society has a utility function for X, and I'm the social planner. And I don't have a utility function. I have only a welfare function. And the welfare function is just the sum of all your individual utilities. And I try to choose a policy that maximizes that welfare function, that does the greatest good for the greatest number. And it turns out that maximizing a welfare function always generates a Pareto-efficient outcome, and any Pareto-efficient outcome was what would have happened if you maximized some welfare function. So in other words, welfare maximization, from this benevolent, fable, social planner standpoint, is exactly the same as Pareto efficiency, is exactly the same as markets in the usual neoclassical model, is exactly the same as war negotiations. This bargaining idea is going to be the glue that puts all these things together in this framework of what's Pareto efficiency, what's Pareto optimality. We need some glue. We have the bricks. We know what we want this edifice to look like. We just don't know how it all goes together just yet, and that's when we introduce bargaining. So let's go to the B block. So what's bargaining? What makes bargaining bargaining? I just said that it's the glue. It's the glue of all of this sort of zero-summiness sort of stuff, bargaining. How is it? What could be the same? What could be the same about how countries are negotiating how to draw a border in their territories and buying a car or bargaining a wage with your employer? And actually, the bargaining model of war, like that sounds glib, but the bargaining model of war, the standard view of war right now, which you've dipped your toe into its waters in the last problem set, and we'll be talking about it often, that's just a modification of a labor model where management and a union are trying to figure out a wage, and if they don't agree, it's a big deal. If they don't agree, this is going to be an important thing, is if they don't agree. Write that down. Here, get out some paper. You ready? Just repeat it. No, don't repeat after me. Actually, you can repeat after me in the comfort of your own home if you want. But you should also write this down. You ready? This is profound. I've forgotten. Oh, no. If they don't agree. That's it. Just take note of if they don't agree. There's a strike. So in the context of labor negotiations, if agreement isn't reached, a strike happens. When you're haggling with a car dealer, if agreement isn't made, you have to walk home, and the car dealer didn't make a sale. It just wasted all that time on you, and they didn't even get a commission. If two countries don't agree about how to draw a border, if they don't agree, they fight a war. So that seems to be an important part about this bargaining thing, is like, if they don't agree. If they don't agree, something bad happens. Something bad. What do I mean bad? I mean something strictly worse for both parties. Oh, that sounds familiar. That sounds familiar. That's starting to sound a little familiar. It's like we were just talking about that. However, note also that management wants wages to be low, whereas unions want wages to be high. Country A wants the border to be far from their capital, whereas country B wants the border to be close to country A's capital. You want the price of the car to be low, and the car dealer wants the price of the car to be high. If we're in a legislature, I want the outcome to be close to my ideological ideal point, and you want the outcome to be close to your ideological ideal point. So, conflicting preferences. There's a zero-sum quality between the people that are negotiating, right? Anything that makes management better makes labor worse off, and vice versa. Anything that makes the car dealer happier makes you worse off, and vice versa. Anything that makes country A happier makes country B worse off, and vice versa. Anything that makes the left party happy makes the right party unhappy, and vice versa. I think all of the clouds have cleared out. And what's left seems to be a two-step thing about what makes bargaining bargaining. Two things make bargaining bargaining. One, the parties have opposed preferences. Car dealers like high-priced cars, car buyers like low-priced cars. Country A wants more territory, country B wants more territory. It's impossible at a certain point in time. What point in time? What point in time is it impossible to give them both more? And you're like, why are you doing that? And I'm like, just think. So they have opposed preferences. There's a zero-sum quality to bargaining, right? What makes one party happier makes the other sadder, and vice versa. 2, disagreement is costly. If you don't agree, you fight a war. If you don't agree, there is a strike. If you don't agree, there will be a tariff. If you don't agree, we will not pass this important resolution at the United Nations. If you don't agree, there will be a civil war on set. If you don't agree. Disagreement is costly. The status quo is Pareto-dominated. So we can draw bargaining problems in the same beautiful triangular space that we were just in. How do we encode bargaining in the how do we make it all work in this space that we've made? Well, it's like this. So I'm going to start off by drawing, let's just keep it two people right now. Let's say it's you and the car dealer, or country A and country B. I'll just call them A and B, right? But please know that A could be you, A could be a country, A could be a firm, A, who knows? And same for B. Okay. A and B. Let's plot them not in penny space, but in utility space. Right? So I'm going to, which was the same for pennies because I had made a monotonicity assumption. I had assumed more pennies, more happiness. I'm just going to plot the happiness. I'm just going to plot the U's. Okay? So on the horizontal dimension will be party A's utility, available utility. And the same for the vertical and party B. And the idea is that I'm just going to plot all of the possible utility combinations in this space. So everything that I cover is a possible vector of utility numbers from some outcome X. So let's not focus on the X's right now. Let's just focus on the utility numbers. Let's be like Mill and Bentham would tell us to be. Okay? So we're looking at all these utility numbers. These are all the possible utility combinations. The fancy word for this is utility imputations. Okay? So here's all the possible combinations of utilities. And you're like, where does this come from? I'm assuming that I know the utility functions, I know the outcome set. I'm telling you, we have a picture that kind of looks like this. Okay? These are all modeling choices that I'm making and not fully announcing. So this is the set of utility imputations. You'll notice that we have a frontier. A frontier can be wiggly, but it's still a frontier. Those are at any point along this wiggly hypotenuse. Wiggly hypotenuse is a good band name. So at any point along this wiggly hypotenuse, I can't go north, I can't go east, and I can't go northeast. These are all utility combinations that can't be beat in a Pareto sense. Okay? So there's my frontier. So I've got all my utility imputations, which has this northeastern boundary, this Pareto frontier. All right? So what makes bargaining bargaining is the fact that the status quo situation, right? Remember, when we started with the pennies and the bowls, country A and country B both had empty bowls. The status quo, which is like if you fail to make an agreement, if bargaining fails, what we revert to, we're going to call that the disagreement point. The disagreement point is just going to be a utility vector. It's just, if we didn't make a deal, how happy would each party be with what happened? Okay? I'll parameterize this in one example later on. Don't worry. Just all this is how happy either party would be if a deal wasn't made. And the idea, one thing that makes bargaining, is the disagreement is costly in a Pareto sense. That means that my disagreement point has got to live in the interior of my squiggly triangle. So, now I've got this set of utility imputations, which is essentially a triangle. It's just it's an artistic triangle. I'm an artist. Okay? And we've got this disagreement point that we know lives in the interior of the triangle, which is to say there exist alternatives that Pareto-dominate whatever the status quo situation is. Now I want to show you something cool. And you're like, it's about time. So suppose that party A had a very good disagreement point. Suppose that their backup plan was really good. So if they're buying a car, suppose that they don't really mind public transportation. Okay? So let's say the party A is well off, so their disagreement point is pretty far east. Okay? It's still in the interior, but it's pretty good as they see it. And let's suppose that things aren't so good from party B's standpoint in terms of the status quo. So in other words, I'm going to say that having a good disagreement point is the same thing as having bargaining power. So in this vignette, the disagreement point is drawn in a way to show that party A has a lot of bargaining power and party B, country B, doesn't have a lot of bargaining power. Okay. Now the point that I want to make is that from here, not if this is the status quo, if this is the fallback option, then not all Pareto-efficient outcomes are relevant, because not all of them are better from both parties' view. What do I mean by that? Well, if I draw a vertical line through this disagreement point, which is over here. So if I draw a vertical line through the disagreement point, okay, if I draw a vertical line through it, everywhere west of that line, everywhere west of this line is worse from party B's perspective than the fallback option. Their disagreement point is better than the Pareto outcomes that are west. Even though they're Pareto efficient, they just aren't good enough from party A's standpoint to warrant making a deal compared to the disagreement point. Likewise, if I draw a horizontal line through the disagreement point, everywhere south of that line is worse from party B's standpoint relative to the disagreement point. Okay? I can lop off that part of the Pareto frontier, and what I'm left with is the set of relevant Pareto efficient outcomes. Now these are all outcomes that are better from both parties' perspective than disagreement, or are at least as good and strictly better for at least one party. Right? These Pareto dominate the disagreement point, and they're Pareto efficient. This is what you might call the bargaining range. Okay, this set of relevant Pareto efficient outcomes. Better than not making a deal for both parties, and Pareto efficient. Now, notice that because in this vignette, party A has a lot of bargaining power, and party B doesn't, all of the relevant outcomes, the entire bargaining range, is pretty far east and pretty far south. So whatever the good deals are, whatever the deals that get made are, they're pretty good from party A's standpoint. Why? Because they came in with a lot of bargaining power. Just to be complete, let's say that we switch. Let's move things from the southeast to the northwest. So let's say the disagreement point was very good for party B and very bad for party A. And if I perform the same analysis with the lines, you'll notice that all of the deals that could get made from that disagreement point are good for party B and not so good for party A. So good disagreement points mean good outcomes from your standpoint. And you're like, but how do I know the disagreement point? Well, we just did one. We did one last week on our problem set. So in the bargaining model of war, we have, I'm just going to redraw this doodle a little bit, because we have two parties, two countries. We have two countries, and they're risk averse or risk neutral. So it turns out the set of utility imputations then doesn't have any wiggle. It's just like this this bendy one, okay? So here's the set of all utility imputations. And we know that if you get everything, the happiest you could be in the model is 1, right? So for example, I can only go to the east 1 unit. That's the situation where country A has everything and country B has nothing. And if I ride that up here, now I'm at the situation where country B has everything and country A has nothing, in terms of the smiley faces. So that's our space. What's the disagreement point? If a deal isn't made, what happens? War happens. What's the utility of war? Well, in expectation, it's P minus CA for country A, and 1 minus P minus CB for country B. Okay, this is about to get cool. This is about to get really cool. So now I've got a disagreement point. I know it's in the interior. Why? Well, I know that I can only go up to 1 in either direction. But I get to 1 in either direction. I can go as many as 1 unit north, and I can go as many as 1 unit east. But P minus CA is less than 1, and 1 minus P minus CB is less than 1. So in this interior, have we our disagreement point? Why am I talking Shakespearean actor like? Yoda, profess not well. It's gonna be, we're a third of the way in, we're a third of the way in, we're a third of the way in. So notice that if P is high, which is to say if country A is powerful, that moves the disagreement point to the southeast. Why? Well, it moves it to the east because it makes country A's disagreement point go up, and it moves it to the south because it makes country B's disagreement point go down. So power, shifting power, shifts the disagreement point. Shifting military power shifts the disagreement point. And we just talked about how it shifts the disagreement point in a way that favors country A and unfavors, disfavors, anti-favors country B. So that's a comparative static result. This is a comparative static result because I'm telling you that as one variable goes up or down, another variable goes up or down. And what I'm saying is, as P goes up, country A's happiness at negotiated settlements goes up. The stronger you are, the better peace is for you. Now you're like, that doesn't seem profound. 1, yes it is. 2, you wouldn't have been able to see it without this sail of awesomeness. I think it's going to look like a sail. This is my guess, right? We'll see. Who knows? It's not like I have a plan. You might think that I have a plan when I start these. So when I start a video, I know what the blocks are going to be, and the rest is improvised. I wish that I knew what I was going to be doing, and you would think that having embarrassed myself now over 4 weeks of videos, I would start planning. Nope. Keep improvising. A lot of my heroes are jazz musicians. I'm amazed with what these great artists were able to do on the fly, and I'm jealous of the fact that I can't. But I try. So that sale of awesomeness is giving us a comparative statics result. Notice also that because of the costs, I can change the disagreement point only horizontally or only vertically. So if country A has high war costs, that moves the disagreement point to the west. And if they have low war costs, that moves the disagreement point to the east. Likewise with up and down for country B. So the entire bargaining model of war is just a bargaining problem in this sale, where we've parameterized the disagreement point a very particular way. We've parameterized it in terms of P's and C's. And what we've just learned is that high P leads to good for country A and bad for country B in terms of their negotiated settlements. And high costs hurt your negotiated settlement no matter what. Now you may be wondering, well, how do we know which of this range of outcomes? How do we know which item in the bargaining range will ultimately be chosen? Well, in your problem set, we're going to talk about a couple of those. But at that point in time, you have to choose a protocol. There will be different games that could get played, right? So from the given status quo, from the given disagreement point, we'll say, and then imagine the country A makes a take it or leave it offer to country B. Or imagine the country B makes a take it or leave it offer to country A. Or imagine they engage in infinite horizon repeated offers bargaining. There's a lot of different bargaining protocols. There are even, as you'll see on your problem set, axiomatic and normative solutions to bargaining problems that actually influenced how Ken Arrow came up with axiomatic ways about thinking about preference aggregation functions. It's all related. Okay? It's all related. So we can have different games that take us from D to one of the outcomes. We could have normative ways to get there. We'll have all sorts of different ways to make that trip from D to that set of bargaining range, Pareto-efficient and relevant outcomes. We'll talk about many different ways, but I don't see what the point of understanding all those different processes is if you don't understand the problem. This is the problem. This is the problem. This is the problem. This is bargaining. Bargaining isn't you haggling. Bargaining, that's all the protocol. We wouldn't have had to invent different ways to solve bargaining problems, which is to say bargaining protocols, if there weren't bargaining problems. This is the bargaining problem. This is neorealism crystallized. This is the problem of war. And I don't mean this glibly. I know that war is awful because of all of the death and the destruction and the tragedy. But if you look at this picture hard enough, if you wait for osmosis to happen, if you stare at this sail long enough, you'll realize that every millimeter in between that frontier and that disagreement point, every little millimeter is people dying. Every little millimeter is things that we didn't make because we were making tanks. Every millimeter of space in here is millions of dollars and an infinitude of the importance of human life. Every millimeter of this picture matters. It's not just a triangle. I hope you're starting to see that. The triangle is our way to try to get to the bottom of this. It is our attempt as analysts to understand. It is a plea for understanding. And if you can understand this picture, I'm telling you, then you can understand a multitude of important, interesting, I sound like Dick Vitale, scintillating, sensational diaper dandy type problems. But they all have a triangle, whether you see it or not. So today we began to take steps toward social, strategic, less vacuumy, more international relations sort of analysis. And before introducing the almost addictive concept of a game, I just wanted us to talk about how a multitude of actors with varying preferences, what sort of a space does that provide for us to write games within? Most classes about applied game theory will begin from a game. They'll just write down a game and say, oh, here's a game, and this is what a game is, and then we talk about games. Okay, and that's fine. That's fine. You know, day one is like the prisoner's dilemma. Day two is chicken. Day three, whatever. That's fine. That's probably how you wish I had been teaching the class. But I would have a couple of replies to that. One, once you see a game, it's hard to unsee it. And before we talk about games, there are just so many things that I think are really important to talk about before we start writing down games. Because once we start to get to games, it's a Plato cave sort of thing. You won't be able to go back to just viewing a problem the same way. So this is a conscious decision on my part. It's also true that rationality as a methodological tool in international relations requires important substantive commitments, right? And I don't want to lie to you. I don't want to not tell you those commitments. But there's another reason, and the reason is today. I think one reason to not write down games for a while is to get to a day like today where you have enough tools about utility functions and sets of players, and you have enough visual intuitions honed by now that you can see that whether it's a game or a market or a preference aggregation function or whatever the method of aggregation, whatever the equilibrium concept is, no matter how we take individuals and map them into the aggregate, nuances arise, wrinkles arise, right? So we saw wrinkles in Arrow's theorem, and we see wrinkles here today with bargaining and optimality. The bargaining problem has nothing to do with games. It has to do with utilities and multiple players. Yeah, it doesn't have anything to do with game theory necessarily. I could come up with solutions to bargaining problems that have nothing to do with game theory. I don't have to talk about ultimatum games or repeated offers or all of the different things we're going to talk about, all of the various ways to solve bargaining problems. I don't have to introduce any of those for us to talk about the bargaining problem itself. However, if I introduce the game first and the problem second, you wouldn't appreciate just how important, how ubiquitous, how fundamental the problem of bargaining is for IR. And I don't want you to see that just from a game theory lens. I want you to see this from a human lens. I want you to see this in a picture that isn't just player 1, player 2, action 1, action 2, because that's all at the margins. The problem of international relations is the problem of scarcity. And the problem of scarcity necessitates at least some Pareto optimality involved analysis. And once we're there, we are in bargaining land. And that's a theoretical point. That's a substantive point that transcends any methodological decisions that we might make. So I'd like to conclude with a provocative thought. We think about bargaining so much in international relations. In the bargaining model of war, a lot of its justification is because of international anarchy. So we have trouble making deals with one another. Countries have trouble making deals with one another. Countries have trouble making peace agreements with one another because of international anarchy. Which is to say, there is no institution that can reliably and credibly enforce any contract that might be drawn up. If you and I write up a contract that is protected under the auspices of a government, right? Then if either of us fails to live up to the deal, then there are avenues for the aggrieved party. If we write a contract up and then I don't live up to my end of the deal, right? Then you have recourse. You have courts, you have lawyers, you have litigation, you have Judge Judy. There's so many things that you could do that are reliable, credible, legitimate institutions that enforce the contract. There is no such thing in international relations. We live in anarchy. There is no international level Judge Judy. There should be, but there isn't. And so we bargain in this shadow of being able to break promises. And this is the fundamental insight of the neo-realist enterprise as it relates to the strategic and rationalist vein, right? So inasmuch as Fear on 95, inasmuch as the bargaining model of war is justified, it's justified by anarchy. And we always have military recourse under anarchy. Countries can always fight. There's always this ultima ratio, right? There's a last handler of disagreement, and that's war. And that's sad, and that's why we bargain. However, the institutions that we have at a domestic level they weren't made on the sixth day. There is no story for where they came from. They arose from processes too. The institutions of government, the organs of government, are all the outcomes of maintained bargaining among parties, right? From the people that wrote down the Constitution to today. And there is legislative bargaining, which is an important strain of the literature. So my question is, if we know that bargaining can happen under anarchy, as in IR, or it can happen under not anarchy, as in sort of the study of legislative institutions that are legitimate, legislative bargaining, what does anarchy have to do with it then? Isn't it just the fact that disagreement is costly? Now, it's true that under anarchy, disagreement is very costly. Disagreement is war costly, whereas disagreement among parties is oh, we have to shut the government down for 10 days and there's a lot of news about it, etc. That's costly disagreement, but it's not the same as war. So my question for you is, are all of the differences in the bargaining among states and the bargaining among parties, are all of the differences between anarchy and not anarchy in terms of bargaining, are those only differences in degree and not of kind? Are they qualitatively different, or are they qualitatively the same and only quantitatively different? Could you wiggle the legislative problem a little bit and turn it into an IR problem? Or are they so far apart that you couldn't really see them the same way no matter how hard you tried? Now that's hard. If you ask me, they're exactly the same. If you ask me, all that a lack of anarchy does is come up with a set of procedures for what disagreement looks like. Although even then, it doesn't always get lived up to. And then we have layers of appeal processes. I think that they're roughly the same, and that anarchy is just a particular way of parameterizing disagreement points. That's provocative. And I don't know how I could wake up tomorrow and feel the exact opposite way. I'm still thinking about this. And I hope that you'll start to think about it now, that you can draw a picture and see it. So on your problem set, you're going to have a chance to think through the war versions and the trade versions, but there won't be domestic versions. And I'm sorry about that, but I just want to make sure that you're thinking about whether international politics is politics. In the same way that domestic politics is domestic politics. And if you do, then why does it look so rough? And if you don't, then why does it look so pleasant? And how are you sure that you're not reverse engineering your views on what kind of bargaining is the real bargaining, on whether or not you think that things are pleasant or awful to begin with? Which is to say, is this all just one gigantic reverse engineered glass half full, glass half empty sort of thing? Regardless, there's a lot of meat on the bone. And I think that we're going to learn a lot in taking it all on. I can't wait to see you Monday so that we can try to decipher some of these triangles together. But until then, thanks for watching.